are the very blueprint of an English prog rock band. They were formed in 1968 in the south of England. They had a classic lineup, which was John Anderson on vocals, Rick Wakeman on keyboards, Steve Howe on guitar, and Chris Squire on bass, and either Bill Bruford or Alan White on drums, depending on what your taste is. They released they have released a fair number of albums. They've had more than their fair share of double albums released. There's been quite a bit of confusion over membership, with people coming and going quite a bit, a higher than normal turnover of members. There's at times been confusion of the name and confusion over their existence. The most extreme band I've come across for these things, but they're pretty far gone. So, for example, one of their albums which charted really well in the 80s, called 90125, was actually going to be released under the name Cinema. They were a group of people who put themselves together especially to make this album, and it wasn't until they got quite a long way through the process that they decided to switch tactic, because they had most of the ex-members of Yes who had ceased to be as a band at that point, and decided to call themselves Yes. Also, there was another album that was released that wasn't released under the album Yes, but basically were Yes. It was released under the name Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe. Lots of confusion. Rick Wakeman, for example, has done 5 different stints with the band. One of my favourite things about them at the moment is that their current lead singer is a guy called John Davison, who early in his singing career was in a Yes tribute band, and he sounded so much like the classic Yes singer John Anderson that when they needed a new singer a few years ago, they approached John Davison, and he is now their permanent lead singer. They're also known for having most of their album covers designed by a guy called Roger Dean, who does fantasy art.
Hi, my name's Dan. So this is a review of a relatively newly released album by Yes. It's their 23rd studio album. I do occasional new release videos. This one was released in May this year. I'm recording this in November. So it's not that new, but it is kind of relatively new, I guess. Most of the videos on this channel are reviews of albums in a list of the 3,000 greatest albums of all time, according to a website called Acclaimed Music. But occasionally I step off that list to do various distractions, and one of them is some new releases. And this one was brought to my attention by one of the people that I've encountered on my channel. So thanks, Cole. I think it was Cole. Yes, so this is progressive rock. You'd kind of imagine it would be, because it's by the band Yes. That is no surprise that it is. So I want to say something about modern progressive rock, which is, well, it's kind of two things really. One is that I like progressive rock. I like prog rock quite a lot. It's really, in some ways, probably my most home ground in terms of what I like musically, and that includes a lot of modern prog rock. By modern, I mean what's sometimes called the third wave, which is kind of late 90s onwards, there's all sorts of amazing stuff that's been produced in the last 20 years or so, but I'm not sure it could really be called progressive anymore, because it's not pushing new boundaries. It's very much following a particular style, and there's a similarity to it. It does have a lot of the things that you'd think of in prog rock, which it has complex music, it's got multi-part tracks, it's got concept albums, it's got fantasy elements and all these sorts of things. But these were things that were established back in the 70s as part of the ethos of various bands that were kind of almost retrospectively labelled prog rock. And then since then, those things have been picked up again and reused. So it's not progressive, but it's still prog rock, I'd say. And this certainly fits in with this third wave, the new wave of prog rock, which is, as I say, late 90s onwards. I would say that there's quite a lot of similarities in sound with bands like the Flower Kings and Transatlantic and other bands of that kind of stable. And there's a kind of like a a subculture thing going on with third wave prog these days. There's a great website called Prog Archives where a lot of these people hang around on the forums, and there's all sorts of great stuff that you can find through there, and I have in the past. Anyway, let's get back to this album. Some of the instruments that drew my attention here were classical guitar, there's an auto harp being used, there's a pipe organ sound, which could be coming from a sampler or a synthesizer, and there's an orchestra at various points as well. And yes, it's got complex structures. It's sometimes got complex time signatures. It's sometimes got fairly complex and extended harmonic structures. And but at other times it's kind of more straightforward. And yes, also it does kind of multi-part tracks. They're fairly long tracks, and they move on from section to section, and very much kind of as is expected in prog rock. And yes, of course, they can play their instruments incredibly well, which is again an expectation, particularly of Yes, I would say. They've always had this kind of sound that's a bit kind of light and high in the tone register, and that comes in here. It's not got a heavy feel to it. There are a couple of patches where it's a bit rockier, but mostly it's actually kind of, light rock verging in, kind of crossing over into classically feels and things like that. Very kind of, yeah, I'm going to say it sounds very much like Yes, but of course it is. Right, let's pick out who's involved then, because we're a long way from the early days of Yes, which was in the 1970s. I think they probably started in 1969. Being able to say whether any original members are still part of the band is difficult, because in the early years they had so much turnover in members, people coming and going for a while. However, their long-term drummer, Alan White, died fairly recently, and he's been replaced by Jay Shellen, who has been their tour drummer for the last 7 years, apparently. Billy Sherwood is on bass here. Now, he was a keyboard player for Yes back in the 90s, but transitioned to bass in more recent years. More of a kind of, earlier stable of Yes is a guy called Jeff Downs, who's here on keyboards. And he's also was in the Buggles and Asia. And he's got a history with Yes that kind of dates from the 80s. Steve Howe is the guitarist, and he's been in and out of Yes. Apparently, he's done 3 stints in Yes since 1970. He is definitely somebody who I would think of as being one of the very much the old guard here. And John Davison is the vocalist, and he's the really curious replacement for John Anderson, in that he sounds almost exactly like John Anderson, who was their vocalist for very, very many years, and was discovered singing in a Yes tribute band, and they invited him to come and audition and join Yes proper. So that's a bit of a roundup there. Musically, it's I would say strong and engaging. It's definitely my kind of music in some ways, in a lot of ways. I particularly liked Mirror to the Sky, which is the 13-minute track, which has got a great big orchestral finish to it. Subject matter, again, people who know about Yes will not be surprised that the subject matter is almost all new age positivity here. For example, we're all luminous like the stars, or we're all connected, and it's very kind of positive and upbeat, but very kind of, I'm not sure what the right word would be. New age, I think, is the best word. I feel like saying pseudo spiritual, but it's spiritual in some way, anyway. But that kind of approach is traditional for Yes. It was John Anderson, who was particularly into that sort of thinking originally, and that seems to have continued. I would say so. I did listen to the album a couple of times, actually, some of it more than twice. And there's a bonus disc that I ended up accidentally listening to some of, but actually quite liked because some of the tracks there are more poppy and kind of more immediately accessible. So some of my probably favourite songs that I listened to in this experience were on the bonus disc. So I will probably try and link in the bonus version when I do the links down below. It's a very hard thing, I think, for a band who are this well established to release a new album and to get the balance right between moving on and staying the same. There'll be some people who want them to do something new and will say, you're just doing the same old thing over again. There'll be some people who, if they do the move on, will get upset because they're not doing the thing that's expected of Yes. I think they have moved on from the 70s. They definitely moved through a phase of quite different stuff when we get to 90125 in the 80s. But they've moved back quite a long way, but they're now kind of third wave prog rather than the initial type of prog. But I have to say, a lot of the third wave was kind of modelled quite strongly on Yes in a lot of ways, I would say. So it's more staying the same, I would say. It's not a bad same that they've stayed. If you like Yes, the old stuff is probably worth your while checking this out. If you like, and you come into this through the more modern prog bands that I mentioned, then it's probably worth your while checking this out because you're probably going to like this quite a lot. I thought it was good, and I did enjoy it, but I didn't find it surprising in any ways. And I also want to say, always with these reviews, I do a clip of music at the start and a clip of music at the end, and this is the kind of album where those two clips are really not going to give you an idea of the full breadth of different stuff that there is going on in this album. So, if you're at all curious, I'd encourage you to have a listen. So that's what I think, and I'd love to know what your take on this album is, so please do talk to me through the comments. That's it from me for now.